I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on ERA Claim Adjustment Reason Code Mapping. My name is Samantha Holvey, and I'm the Director of Community and Education here at WEDI. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to go over a few administrative details. As you have noticed upon joining the webinar, everyone has been placed on mute for the presentation. At the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. In your GoToMeeting control panel, you will see a questions box. Please type your questions or comments into the field and hit enter. Please note that the recording of this webinar along with the slide deck will be posted to the WEDI website, and downloading instructions will be emailed to registrants following the live webinar. I've also gone ahead and uploaded the presentation to the handout section of your GoToMeeting control panel. If you want to go ahead and download the PDF version of the slide deck, it's available for you there as well. Our panel today includes Pam Groze. She is Vice President and Senior Product Manager for PNC Bank's Healthcare Division and has more than 25 years experience in the healthcare industry. Pam also plays a leading role in industry organizations as co-chair of ASCX 12's Payments Work Group, board member for WEDI, co-chair of WEDI's Data Exchange Work Group, and co-chair of WEDI's Remittance Advice and Payments Sub-Work Group. Pam is also the X12 liaison for the Cooperative Exchange. Deb Strickland is another panelist. She is with Conduit's National Standards Consulting Team, Government Healthcare, where she works with clients, customers, and those in need of Conduit services such as compliance services and healthcare solutions. She's a former co-chair of the ASCX 12 Payments Work Group and has now moved to the Program Management Office and continues to be a driving force in the development and maintenance of the X12 transactions. Currently, she's on the WEDI Board of Directors and is the co-chair of the WEDI Remittance and Payment Work Group. Deb also serves as vice chair of the Code Committee, which maintains codes such as claim adjustment reason codes, claim status category codes, etc. She also fills the role of educational chair of the Cooperative Exchange. And our third and final panelist, Amia from CAQH Core, is the manager for CAQH Committee on Operating Rules for Information Exchange. She oversees the core rule development process, including maintenance of the core code combinations, manages the core information request process, and supports CORE's industry education and outreach. Before joining CAQH Core, she served as health policy intern at the National Consumer Voice for Quality Long-Term Care. She comes to healthcare from a prior career in research and evaluation. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to Pam.
Thanks, Sam. Welcome, everyone. Wanted to go over the agenda for our webinar today. First, we want to talk about the description and purpose of the codes that we're talking about, how to determine the mapping for the codes, what tools are available to do that mapping, where to find the codes, what is the maintenance process for these codes, maintenance process for payers doing mapping of the codes, and then where to go with questions. And then finally, we'll end up with a Q&A session at the end. So first, let's talk about what the codes are for. We all know that payers rarely pay the full amount submitted on a claim. But within the transaction, within the remittance advice transaction itself, the claim, the service, and the transaction as a whole must balance. Total charge amount minus all adjustments within the claim must equal the paid amount, even if that paid amount is zero. And providers need to know the reason why the amount wasn't paid in full, the reason for the adjustment. So that's where these codes come into play. Payer systems may include internal or proprietary codes describing the adjustments, and these may show on the paper remittance advice or on web portals. But to create an 835 transaction, the proprietary codes must be mapped to HIPAA-compliant codes. So what codes does the payer need to map as they're looking at electronic remittance advice transactions? First is the claim adjustment group code. This is the group code for the category of the adjustment. There's also the claim adjustment reason code, the remittance advice remark code, and the NCPDP reject code. NCPDP has some additional codes that are used in addition to the RARC or remittance advice remark codes that are used specifically for pharmacy claims. So what purpose do these codes serve? The group codes are used in the CAS segments of the 835, and they identify who is responsible for the amount being adjusted. The Claim Adjustment Reason Codes, or CARCs, are also used in the CAS segments, and these codes explain the general reason for the amount that is not being paid by the healthcare payer. Remittance Advice Remark Codes, or RARCs, are used in the MIA or MOA or the LQ segments of the 835. These remark codes further explain the reason for the reduction in payments, so they work in conjunction with the CARC to further clarify the reason for the reduction in payment. There are also alert RARCs that provide some more generic information about actions the provider can take, and these are not associated with a specific CARC. So this may be something like information about the provider being able to appeal a decision. So all of these codes work together to provide a complete message to the provider. So as an example, the group code may be CO, indicating contractual obligation. A CARC may be 16, which indicates the claim or service lacks information or has submission or billing errors, and this information is needed for adjudication. Then the remark code, or RARC, N391, that can be sent along with that CARC, indicates missing emergency department records. So you can see how the RARC fills in the information of what was missing that was indicated by the CARC 16. Without that remark code, N391, the provider would have to call the payer to find out what was missing in order to know what to resubmit. So what do providers do with these codes? The group codes, CARCs, and RARCs are all reviewed together to determine what action that needs to be taken on the claim. First and foremost, all of that information needs to be posted to the accounts receivable system, hopefully in an automated fashion. Assuming the practice management system can do some automatic reconciliation and posting, then that allows the provider to automatically post that information back. The provider may need to take contractual or other write-offs on their system. They may need to resubmit or correct some claims and then get that resubmitted. There may be secondary insurance billing that needs to take place. The provider may need to determine what patient responsibility is still in effect and get the patient statements out to bill the patient for that amount. There may need to be appeals to take place. The provider may need to submit supporting documents and resubmit their claims. Or there may be other denial management processes that need to take place. So why should the payer use the most detailed codes? Payers should map their internal codes to the group code, CARC, and RARC code combinations that best match the meaning of their internal proprietary codes. This gives the provider the information needed to accurately post and take the appropriate follow-up actions. It allows and promotes automated posting by the provider's practice management system, and it provides standardization for the provider, the same codes across multiple payers. Payers who map effectively can reduce provider inquiries and misinterpretations, increase provider satisfaction, increase the accuracy of statements that go out to patients, and encourage the use of electronic transactions, which is a benefit to both providers and payers. If the payer does not use the most detailed code possible, but instead uses a generic claim adjustment reason code, there is a significant impact to the provider. The provider will not have enough information to determine what action should be taken with the claim. This then will require a phone call to the payer to determine what needs to happen. This may cause the provider to continue to use the paper remittance advice rather than the ERA or EFT. This then increases costs for both the payer and provider, causes delays in accounts receivable updates for the provider because they have to then manually post. This results in increased operational costs for the provider and a loss of productivity, and can result in delays in secondary billing. The provider may choose to take an action rather than call the payer, and this may result in an incorrect action being taken because they may make assumptions. This can then result in inaccurate patient billing and a dissatisfied patient and provider. So now I'll turn it over to Deb to talk about how payers can determine how to map between their internal proprietary codes and the standards. Deb?
Thank you so much, Pam. So how do payers determine the mapping? So most payers have between 1,000 to 1,500 internal codes that are proprietary that have to be mapped to these standard codes. So what the payer should do is create a maintenance process to ensure that they have consistent use of the standard codes that are available to them. So there are a number of industry resources that are available to make this process easier. It is a tough road to climb, but it does have to be done. And you know, once you do it once and you have a good maintenance process, it's easier to maintain. So one of those resources is the ASC X12 835 Healthcare Claim Payment Advice 835 TR3. The other is the CAQH Core Phase 3 Core 360 Uniform Use of the Claim Adjustment Reason Code and Remittance Advice Remark Rule. And CAQH Core specifies a max set of code combinations that can be used for the 4 defined business scenarios. If the payer's code or message doesn't fall into one of these 4 scenarios, then any other code combination can be used. So what that means is if you don't fit into the business scenarios that CAQH Core has defined codes for, then you can use whatever you need to use. And you want to, as Pam mentioned, try to get to the most granular use of those codes so that the provider knows exactly what you're trying to say. So tools available, additional tools is the Technical Report 2, which is a code value usage in healthcare claim payments and subsequent claims. This is for those situations that fall outside of the CAQH Core defined business scenarios. This is a reference or an encyclopedia of sorts that you can go, and it has all the group code, CARC, and work combinations, all the possible combinations that would make sense. And that is available for purchase at www.x12.org. Next slide. So now we want to know where these codes are located. So the CARC and work codes can be found at wpc-edi.com, and it's in the reference section. So once you go into the reference section, there's a list of healthcare code lists, and the CARC and the RARC are the top 2 in that list. And that's where you can click into them, and then you can get more information and see the code list. The group codes are found in the technical report itself. So it's in the 835 implementation guide or technical report 3. These could change as the versions of the transaction change. So you always want to be referencing the current version. And the NCPDP codes can be located at http://www.ncpdp.org resources guidance documents. And then of the CAQH Core combinations for those 4 business scenarios can be found at caqh.org Core Ongoing Maintenance Core Code Combinations CAQH Core 360 Rule. So those are the URLs where you can find these codes for your reference. You'll want to have those handy as you're going through your mapping process. And of course, as we mentioned on the prior slide, the Technical Report 2 is available at x12.org. Next slide. So what if a payer cannot find a comparable CARC or RARC for a match to their internal code? So what you want to do in this situation is to request a code, right? So we don't want you to sit there and try to make something, force something into work that's not going to work and not going to give the provider the true message. There's a maintenance process for both CARCs and RARCs. It's well defined across the industry, and it's used very well. And what you do is you send in a code request. The change request form here is, again, in that reference section. So as soon as you select Claim Adjustment Reason Code or CARC off of that code list, you can see the change request form, and you just fill out the necessary information in there. Pam, can you advance? I think there's a couple of messages that we should take a look at here. So one of the things that you want to do as you're preparing to request a code is to request a meeting or a phone call with someone who is a committee member, who is someone who represents your sector of the industry. So either it's a blue or it's a commercial payer, or there's any number of members of this committee who can walk you through the process, just kind of let you know what's going to happen to the list, especially if you're not going to be able to be in attendance for the meeting in person. Then that person can help represent your request, because sometimes there are questions of other members that may have, and they would need to have clarifying questions answered. So it's always good to have that person, you know, to also know your request and your needs. So the way that you find out who can represent you or who you can contact is you go into FAQs, and then there's a list of things in there, and you want to go to who maintains a list. And then that will open up, and you'll be able to see all of the members of the committee, and you'll be able to select the person who's closest to your part of the industry. Okay, next slide, please. So when are the codes updated? So CARC requests are reviewed 3 times a year in conjunction with the ASD X12 standing meetings. That would be January, June, and September. The results of the code committee meetings are published about 30 days after the meeting, and they'll be including all of the updates from that last meeting. Sometimes codes are you know, brand new and available right away. Sometimes there's a lead time, and so you want to go ahead and check that list and see when those codes will be available and which codes are available to you now. The RARC requests are reviewed monthly by a committee of CMS representatives, and the results are also published 3 times a year around the same time as the CARC codes. And they'll include the active code list as well. Now, again, we'll mention the group codes. Those are included in the 835 TR3 technical report themselves, and those changes will be included as the new versions are published. So as these new implementation guides come out, you'll be able to go ahead into those documents and see if anything changed around the group codes. Next slide. So the technical report document is updated based upon the results of the code committee meeting. So they take those results and take a look at them across a year or so and see if other code combinations maybe are applicable, and they add them to that sort of encyclopedia of code lists. This is a good reference for you because, you know, not all codes fit together, but this at least helps you to narrow down what things codes, CARCs, and RARCs will fit together nicely and will be meaningful across the industry. And then the NCPDP codes are updated quarterly in conjunction with the NCPDP workgroup meetings, and those new new codes can be requested from NCPDP via the ncpdp.org standards development and development process link. Now I'd like to hand it over to Omni to discuss the CAQH 360 rule.
Great, thanks, Deb. So moving to the next slide. I know that both Pam and Deb have referenced the core 360 rule and the core code combinations in their presentations, but we wanted to start with just a little bit of background on the problem space for the rule and the code combinations, and really what issue the code combinations are addressing. So prior to the core code combinations, there really was some extensive confusion in the industry around how to use the CARCs and RARCs. There are currently over 300,000 potential code combinations from which health plans could select to report a claim payment denial or adjustment situation, and then additionally combined with lack of guidance in the standard code list in 835 about how to combine those individual CARCs and RARCs to report similar claim payment situations, there really was a resulting inconsistency in how the CARCs and RARCs are combined across health plans to report similar claim payment denial or adjustment situations. And this inconsistency was challenging for both providers and payers. There's a lot of manual follow-up in terms of providers calling to understand the reason for a claim payment denial decision, providers having to resort to inappropriate write-offs or inability to auto-post payments, and then a general reluctance to implement 835 amongst providers. So the core code combinations address this problem space by establishing a standard set of CARC and RARC and group code combinations that are then used to report a minimum set of claim payment denial or adjustment situations that are common across healthcare payers. Next slide, please. So as shown on this slide, the code combinations are maintained on a year-round basis by the multi-stakeholder core code combinations task group via the code combinations process. The task group conducts two types of review. Compliance-based reviews occur 3 times per year, and these reviews only consider changes that are applied to the base CARC and MARC list by the code committees, which Deb referenced. The compliance-based reviews are triggered when the CARC and MARC lists are updated, which occurs in March, July, and November. And then an updated set of code combinations is published about 3 months later after the publication of the updated base code list. Additionally, the code combinations include a market-based review, which occurs once a year. And this review really just considers industry submissions to reflect changing industry usage and evolving business needs. And so for the market-based review, an industry survey is open that allows industry entities to submit any potential adjustments to the code combinations for consideration by the task group. This market-based review always occurs concurrent with the March CBR, such that the resulting adjustments can be published in an updated code combinations version along with a set of compliance-based reviews. So this really enables us to only publish 3 sets of code combination updates a year. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the code combinations task group is responsible for the maintenance of the core code combinations via the process outlined on the prior slide. The task group is composed of over 40 multi-stakeholder core participating organizations and led by 4 co-chairs, each representing a different stakeholder group in the industry. Again, the task group's maintenance efforts are year-round. So most recently, the task group completed a compliance-based review in response to code list updates that were published on July 3rd. And these task group approved adjustments were included in the most recent core code combination version 3.4.1 that was published on October 4th. Currently, the task group is in the preparation stages to launch a second compliance-based, well, actually a third compliance-based review for the year in response to code list updates that will be published this coming Wednesday on November 1st. Additionally, we will also be launching the industry survey to collect potential industry submissions for market-based adjustments to the core code combinations. And this survey will be launching sometime next month. Next slide, please. So the CAQH Core 360 rule specifies the requirements for both health plans and provider-facing vendors to implement and conform to the core code combinations and associated business scenarios. So beginning with the health plan conformance requirements, the rule requires that health plans or their PBM agents align their internal codes and code systems and system mapping to the core business. The rule also requires core code combination to report a claim payment denial or adjustment situation that a health plan is into one of the use of the core defined business scenarios. So when a health plan is reporting a business scenario that fits into one of the 4 identified in the prior slide, the health plan must use one of the core code combinations identified in the core code combinations document to report that specific core defined business scenario. However, note that additionally, health plans can develop additional business scenarios and associated code combinations when the core defined business scenarios do not meet their business needs. So as Pam stated, if the health plan has a business scenario that falls outside of those 4 defined by core, health plans are able to use additional code combinations not defined by core to describe and report those non-core business scenarios. I want to clarify that any additional code combinations or any additional business scenarios cannot conflict with the core defined set. So again, a non-core business scenario that's being reported with a non-core code combination could not be identical to one of the 4 business scenarios defined by core or one of the code combinations outlined in the core code combination set. Additionally, The Core 360 rule does allow health plans to use any individual codes in the core code combinations in non-core business scenarios. So any individual CARCs, RARCs, or group codes in the core code combinations can be used in a non-core business scenario or non-core code combination. Again, with that caveat that the non-core scenarios and code combinations cannot repeat or duplicate the core defined set. And it is important to note that the intent of the Core 360 rule is that for maximum benefit and clarity, all CARCs should be mapped to a single claim denial, payment, or adjustment business scenario. So while a health plan can use a CARC in the core defined business scenarios to report a non-business scenario, core defined scenario, as long as it's not in a core code combination, the intent really is that all CARCs should report a single business scenario. And this intent is highlighted in the criteria that the task group uses to evaluate potential adjustments to the core code combination. Next slide. So now that we've covered what the rule requires health plans to do, there again is a lot of room for what the rule does not require health plans to do. So again, the Core 360 rule does not include all CARCs and RARCs that are in the standard code list. We have received some requests in the past about individual CARCs that are not in the code list and whether or not they can be continued to be used. Yes, any CARC or RARC in the standard list that's not in the core code combination can be used outside of the core business scenarios. The core code combinations really identifies only those CARCs and RARCs that are applied to the core defined business scenarios. Additionally, the Core 360 rule does not require health plans to change their internal mappings or usage for any codes that are not in the core code combinations. So health plans are free to use any CARCs or RARCs not in the core code combinations in any outside of the core business scenarios and any non-core code combinations. And finally, the core code combinations do not address use of informational or alert RARCs. The code combinations really are specific to supplemental RARCs, which provide additional explanation for the adjustment described by a CARC. So alert RARCs could be used in addition to the core code combinations as they are outside the scope of the requirements touched and addressed by the core code combination. Next slide. And we want to speak to the requirements for provider-facing vendor products outlined in the rule. So in addition to the health plan requirements, the 360 rule does require that provider-facing vendors that extract data from the 835 for manual processing display to that end user or provider text that describes the group codes, the codes, CARCs, RARCs, and group codes in the ERA, as well as text that describes the corresponding core defined business scenario. So this text should match what is in the published code list for the CARC RARCs or the 835 TR3 for the group code. And then for the core defined business scenario, it should match the text that is provided for the scenario descriptions in the CAQH Core 360 rule. Next slide. So we do have several resources available to entities implementing the CAQH Core 360 rule and the core code combinations. There is a dedicated set of FAQs specific to the Core 360 rule and the core code combinations that is available via the link shown there on the slide. Additionally, CAQH Core has a dedicated page specific to the core code combination statements. It provides information on the current versions of the code combinations, the past versions, how to submit market-based adjustments, the timeline for implementation and conformance. It also it is updated for each publication of the core code combinations to outline the changes that are included in that current version. So it's a pretty handy and thorough resource on the core code combinations, and I encourage everyone to visit that webpage. Additionally, we have a specific implementer resource in the CAQH Core EFT and ERA analysis and planning guide, as well as numerous case study websites and webinars and other education outreach resources that assist with implementation that are available via our Core Education and Implementation Resource Center. And if any of these resources are not doing the job, we certainly welcome your questions, concerns, or comments at core@caqh.org. And with that, I will hand it back to Deb.
Okay, great. Okay, so as we talked about trying to maintain a large list of codes and combinations, so it begs the question, how should a payer create this maintenance process, right? So what you want to do as a payer is to create an internal committee that will maintain the code mapping. You want to have folks like the policy people, legal folks, make sure you have bilingual folks, especially if you expose these codes and combinations to your members or providers in different languages. Definitely claim staff and your remittance staff as well. You want to get this committee together 3 times a year, probably around March, August, and November, and that's when those code lists will be updated and all of the changes will be on the WPC-EDI website. And then you want to coordinate that activity, make sure it's on the calendar and plan so it's not something that people can just miss. So the payers also, one of the options is that you can purchase a subscription service from WPC-EDI, and that would be a CSV file, I believe, and that will explain all of the changes to the lists, any modifications, adds, and deletes. So you can sort of sort that list in that way. And the payer should pull any changes from CAQH Core that may have happened across, either that year or, as Omni was just saying, during the maintenance process. So any changes there. So you want to have all these documents handy and ready as you're going through the review. So what you want to do is to review any of the items changed against your mapping. So if you sort the list by things that have changed, and then you can take that against what your, any of the codes that you've already mapped to those codes to see if they've changed. Sometimes there's a change in verbiage. Sometimes there's like an add or a minor change to the language. So you just want to make sure that if any changes happen, that they still fit. If you have a code that is deactivated, there's usually some time, 6 months or so that we give in order for people to find a better code or a code that will match. And again, if it doesn't happen, if you can't find a code and we've deactivated the code that you were using, you do want to make a change request, a code request via the online form. You also want to notify your providers of these changes to your code mappings, because sometimes providers have in their practice management systems, they're keying off a certain code combinations. So if that were to happen and you'd go and change a code combination, now they could be making things messy inside their practice management system and routing things to the incorrect locations. So just be mindful that on the other side, on your provider side, they are using this information. It's valuable information for routing and getting things to the right place. So you want to make sure that you are in close communication with them as you make any of these revisions. Okay, next slide. So here's the life cycle. So first you have your initial mapping. Again, I have to say, it's going to be a bear. It's a tough hill to climb, but once you do it and everybody's familiar with how the process rolls, it's much easier to maintain once it's done. Then you get the code updates 3 times a year, and you can get them from Washington Publishing. And then you pull together your maintenance committee, and then you finalize your update to your mapping, and then you send out a communication notifying your provider. So this is just sort of the process that you would take 3 times a year in order to get your codes up to date with all of the changes that the industry is making. Okay, next slide. So as we've touched on a little bit, so where do you go if you have questions? So you can go to the CAQH Core Code Combinations at core@caqh.org, as Omni had mentioned. CARCs or code combinations that are outside CAQH Core, you can go to codes-help@x12.org. And for the TR2, you can also go to codes-help@x12.org. Next slide. So here are some key facts that we want to just make sure that, in summary, that we have made sure we came across with. So There are lots and lots of code combinations to choose from. The operating rules only limit the code combinations used when one fits into the defined 4 business scenarios. So that's very important to keep in mind, because we did have some payers who thought that they could only use those codes that were in those 4 business scenarios. And it really causes a problem, because there's so much that falls outside those 4 business scenarios, and you can use any code mappings there instead of trying to shoehorn all of your codes into fitting into those 4 business scenarios. Because of course we know there's a lot of other business scenarios that are out in the industry, and we want to make sure that you are communicating the most accurate code combinations so that your providers know exactly what you're trying to tell them. The TR2 is the as you're too handy when you're in your maintenance meetings, because that's going to help. You're doing mapping, have a helping. You want to see reference of codes that are available to you and codes that match together across the industry. Would that really ever happen? And so it is a very useful encyclopedia of the code combinations. If a payer does not find a code combination that fits the need, a new code in one of those code and capacities, and their CARC or RARC could be requested, and we encourage you to do that and not to just try to sit back and use a code that's not quite a good fit. Because once it goes to the code committee, once you have a conversation with your sector representative, you may actually get some suggestions from them, or ideas of other codes that might be used together to fit into what you're actually doing. If not, then you go ahead and move forward with your code request. So if a payer does think that the code combination belongs in a CAQH core scenario, and that can also be requested, and then maintaining the code changes is going to save time for both the payer and provider in the long run. You don't want to let these things get out of sync, because once you do, it's a bigger hill to climb again. So if you just do it 3 times a year, the changes are usually a small handful of changes that come out of those committee meetings, and then it's much more manageable to do it that way than to try to say wait for a year and then try to do everything back a year. So it also makes you have timely use of the new code combinations that might be available. Next slide. So now we will turn it over to Sam for the questions section.
Thank you. So once again, instructions for questions. If you have any questions for the panelists, please type them into your questions box, hit enter. And while we're waiting for our attendees to have any questions, is there anything else that any of the speakers or panelists would like to add?
This is Pam, and I think one more thing I'd like to add is that an additional way to gain information or have your voice heard is to participate in the groups that talk about these CARCs, RARCs, group codes, etc. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do that, and one way is to participate within WEDI. The Remittance Advice and Payment Subwork Group meets the first and third Monday of every month. And we have open discussion. If you have a specific question on a CARC or RARC, a combination, etc., you're certainly welcome to come participate in the work group and talk about your question. And we can talk that through with the work group, come to a consensus on the answer. Another area to go to ask questions or have discussion is within X12. And the payments work group, the 835 work group, often has discussions on CARCs and RARCs. This work group reviews all of the requests that come in prior to the codes committee meeting at each quarter. So we do have extensive discussions on the CARCs and RARCs that are not only in existence, but then new ones that are coming up. So it's a great way to come and learn about what might be upcoming, but also ask questions, have discussions. We often have discussions if members have questions about use of a certain CARC or RARC. We discuss that often, and that work group meets every Wednesday. And then, as Omni mentioned, you also have the opportunity to ask questions of CAQH Core through the email that was mentioned in her slides, or through participating in the task group that looks at the market-based review as well as the compliance-based review after each of the quarterly CODES committee meetings. So there are multiple opportunities for asking questions and getting involved, and I would certainly encourage everyone to do that.
Thank you very much, Pam. And we don't have any questions from any of the attendees. I will remind everybody the slides are available right now in the GoToWebinar handout section. I will also be emailing everybody after the webinar with the link to download a recording of the webinar along with the slide deck. And if you have any questions that you think of afterwards, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to pass your question along to our wonderful panelists, who I'd like to thank very much for taking your time on this Monday to meet with us today and all the work that goes into producing these webinars. I certainly appreciate all the time and effort that our panelists have put into it, and thank you for everyone. Thank you to everyone for participating as well. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or need further information. But thank you, everyone, for a great webinar.